In the shadow of Oregon's rugged Siskiyou Mountains, a desperate act of violence in 1923 would forever change the landscape of American crime and justice. The Southern Pacific Railroad's train number 13, commonly known as the San Francisco Express, became the setting for what many historians consider the last great train robbery of the American West. The DeAutremont brothers, Ray, Roy, and Hugh, three young men from humble beginnings, unleashed a sequence of events that left four men dead, launched the largest manhunt of its era, and ultimately marked a turning point in forensic science. Their botched robbery attempt and the scientific methods used to identify and capture them bridged two distinct worlds: the fading frontier justice of America's wild past and the emerging modern era of evidence-based investigation. As the steam from Train 13's locomotive rose into the mountain air that fateful October day, neither the DeAutremonts nor the men they encountered could have imagined how profoundly this failed heist would shape the evolution of criminal investigation in America. For Footprints of the Frontier, this is the tale of the deadliest heist of the Old West, as the era's golden years finished at sunset and encroached upon both night and a new dawn. Identical twins Ray and Roy DeAutremont were born on March 30th, 1900 in Iowa. Their younger brother Hugh arrived on February 21st, 1904 in Arkansas. Their father, Paul P. DeAutremont, had French roots, while their mother, Isabella Bertha Wambacher, came from German heritage. The family eventually made their home in Albany, Oregon, where their father ran a barbershop. As they grew older, all three brothers earned their living in the harsh, physically challenging logging industry. By 1916, the twins had started wandering from home, particularly after their father suddenly left the family. With few ties keeping them in place, they learned to live on the move, jumping from freight trains to find work. They picked up whatever jobs they could find, including fruit harvesting, just to survive. Ray DeAutremont particularly embraced the labor movement, joining the Industrial Workers of the World, or IWW, commonly called the Wobblies. Founded in Chicago in 1905, the IWW sought to create a unified force of workers across all industries. Their ideas were based on industrial unionism and had a strong tie to socialism and anarchist groups. Their bold, often aggressive methods sparked both support and criticism. Ray's connection to the IWW brought him legal problems. In 1919, his involvement with the organization led to his placement in a reformatory in Monroe, Washington, where he spent almost a year locked up. The following year, during the nationwide Red Scare, when fear of communist and radical influences ran high, authorities arrested Ray in Vancouver, Washington, as part of a widespread effort to capture suspected Bolshevik supporters. After serving another year in a Pacific Northwest jail cell, he reunited with his twin brother in 1921. Hugh DeAutremont chose a different life path. Unlike his older brothers, he stayed committed to his education and did well both in studies and sports. A top student, he also played quarterback for his high school football team. After finishing school in 1922, he joined Ray and Roy at a logging camp in Silverton, Oregon. At the time, Silverton was a fast-growing timber town off the banks of Silver Creek. It was as blue-collar as Cascadia could come for the era. Many of the men were sons of frontiersmen and grandsons of fur trappers who had traversed the westward trails for a century before settling in the seas of evergreen pastures. For most, life in Silverton defined the American dream. For the DeAutremont brothers, Silverton defined the antithesis. They sought riches beyond the confines of labor and turned to a life of outlawry, like their ancestors' antagonists who plundered the plains. What better place than the woodlands of the Pacific Northwest to lay the seeds of their bad break, where all three worked under false names to hide their identities. Their use of fake names was just the beginning of a much bigger deception, one that would soon lead them into one of the most infamous final chapters of Old West lore. The DeAutremont brothers worked as loggers under aliases for 4 months before turning to a much riskier plan. On October 11, 1923, they tried to rob the San Francisco Express, a Southern Pacific Railroad train traveling from Portland to San Francisco. They chose to attack when the train passed through the Siskiyou Mountains, a tough area along the Oregon-California border. The brothers thought the train carried lots of money, and they saw their chance when it made its regular stop at Tunnel 13 to check the brakes. Built in 1887 through solid rock, Tunnel 13 sat beneath Siskiyou Pass, the highest point on the Southern Pacific route between Portland and Southern California. Trains on this path faced a steep climb out of Ashland, often needing an extra engine to push them up the slope. At the tunnel's east entrance, called the Siskiyou Workstation, train crews would perform safety checks before starting the dangerous downhill journey into California. The DeAutremonts thought this stop created the perfect opportunity to attack. While planning, the brothers found an empty cabin hidden in the woods above the tunnel, next to the old Dollar Hide toll road. They stored supplies there, including food, guns, and a full box of dynamite with a detonator. For weeks, they schemed the entire heist, clocking the necessary timing and preparing for perfection. By the time the dogwood and maple leaves ripened into a sunset yellow, it was time for the final stick-up of the Old West to commence. Around noon on October 11th, Ray DeAutremont waited at the west entrance of the tunnel with the dynamite, while his brothers, Roy and Hugh, carrying a sawed-off shotgun and pistols, walked over the pass to the east side. At about 12:30 p.m., the southbound train arrived at the tunnel's eastern entrance. The train had an engine, a mail car, 4 baggage cars, and 3 passenger coaches. As expected, the helper engine detached and moved to a separate track, making way for the main locomotive. Before engineer Sidney Bates and fireman Marvin Sang could finish their safety checks, Roy and Hugh jumped from their hiding place and climbed aboard, forcing Bates to drive the train forward through the tunnel, stopping just outside the western entrance. The brothers wanted to rob the mail car, believing it held a fortune. But postal clerk Elvin Doherty, sensing trouble, locked himself inside. The robbers yelled for him to open the door, but he wouldn't. They demanded again, but Doherty refused to give in. With no other option, the DeAutremonts decided to use their backup plan: explosives. The fate of the train and everyone on it was about to take a deadly turn. The robbery plan of the DeAutremont brothers went terribly wrong the second Roy made a critical error. Instead of using just a few dynamite sticks to break open the mail car door, he set off the whole box. The huge explosion ripped through the car, killing postal clerk Elvin Doherty right away, and turning the compartment into a pile of debris. But instead of finding piles of money or gold, the blast merely scattered mailbags around. Their target had been wrong from the beginning. The loud explosion caught the attention of Coyle Johnson, a brakeman working in Ashland. Thinking the noise came from the train's boiler, he walked through Tunnel 13 to check. As soon as he stepped out from the western exit, the brothers shot him, killing him immediately. Worried that more railroad workers from nearby Siskiyou Station would arrive soon, they also shot and killed engineer Sidney Bates and fireman Marvin Sang. A later examination by the coroner showed a disturbing fact. Each of the murdered men had been trying to surrender when they were shot, as the bullets first went through their arms before hitting their heads. One of the DeAutremont brothers later made the following statement, giving crystal clear details of the botched heist, as follows. Roy gave the detonator a push, and the mouth of the tunnel was rocked by a tremendous explosion. It was far stronger than we had planned. In fact, the blast was so severe that the mail clerk was blown to bits. I then took the fireman and started back down the track to uncouple the mail car. But the gassy and smoky air was too thick, so I called for the fireman. The fireman and engineer were then marched to the car. In a few seconds, I saw someone coming with a red lantern from the passenger cars, still in the tunnel. I shot the man, who was the conductor, with my shotgun, and at the same time, Hugh shot him with his .45 Colt. The man staggered, and I could see he was dying. Hugh walked over to him and shot him again, in cold blood. The engineer was put back into the cab, and Hugh told him to pull the main car up ahead. He attempted to do this a number of times, but the engine wheels merely spun and the cars failed to move. Hugh then put the engineer back on the ground side next to the fireman, while Ray and I looked the thing over to see what could be done about uncoupling the mail car and engine. But there was nothing we could do. So we walked back to the mail car and entered through the blown-out front end. Our flashlights could not cut the steam and smoke, so we left the mail car. Hugh, in the meantime, had ordered the engineer back into the cab. The fireman was standing alongside the engine with his arms in the air. Ray and I had a brief consultation as to what we should do. We decided to kill the fireman. Ray shot him twice with the Colt. Hugh had the engineer covered, and I shouted at him to bump him off, and then we would clear out. We didn't want any witnesses. Hugh quickly shot the man in the head with a shotgun. We then fled to our cache, which was between 2 and 3 miles northeast of the south entrance of the tunnel. Despite all the violence, the robbery failed completely. The train carried no fortune, and when a second conductor rushed to an emergency phone to alert officials in Ashland, the brothers had to run away. Federal postal inspectors quickly came to the area, the first responders who discovered the scene of the crime. For almost 2 weeks, the DeAutremonts stayed hidden in the wilderness, using a secret shelter they had prepared ahead of time. They had stored enough supplies to wait out the first search efforts, and for a while, this strategy seemed to work. Armed search groups looked through the rough and scabbed land, while Forest Service and Army planes searched the thick forests from above. National Guard soldiers went house to house, checking barns and mills and farmhouses along the Pacific Highway, but the brothers had vanished without leaving nary a clue. Or so, that's what everyone thought. Until one of the greatest feats of early crime scene analysis materialized, bringing real-world detective work to the dying days of the Wild West. While the manhunt for the 3 murderous siblings stretched into 4 years of saltwater taffy, investigators were working with plenty of leads behind the scenes. The word around town spoke of little evidence, but thanks to the evasive maneuvers of brothers DeAutremont, it bought forensic scientists time to collect enough clues to crack the case. Forensic science was hardly a respected profession at the onset of the Roaring '20s. Rather, crime scene investigations depended more on practical knowledge and gut feelings than scientific methods. Police officers, trained detectives, and local officials worked together, using common sense and street wisdom to find who killed engineer Sidney Bates and fireman Marvin Sang. Once they understood how serious the crime was, they started a huge search, the biggest of its kind at that time. The hunt included train company investigators, local citizens, sheriff's deputies from both Oregon and California, Oregon National Guard members, and police from nearby areas. They tried something new, using planes to look for the escaped criminals in the rough mountain landscape. This was one of the first times in history that law enforcement used aircraft during an investigation. At the scene of the crime, officials found Bates and Sang's bodies close to the train engine, both killed with gunshots to the head. Brakeman Coyle Johnson, who had been riding on the train and accidentally walked into the dangerous situation, was shot 4 times in the stomach and later died from these wounds. They also found what was left of mail clerk Elvin Doherty inside the burned mail car, killed by the dynamite explosion that failed to reveal the wealth the robbers had expected. While searching the area, investigators found an unusual clue. 3 burlap bags soaked in creosote had been dragged on the ground, likely an attempt to stop tracking dogs from following their scent. As they widened their search, officers found a black travel bag that still had a railroad shipping tag attached. They arrested and questioned more than a dozen people about the crime, but made little progress identifying who really did it. About 2 miles south of Tunnel 13, authorities finally uncovered their first lead, finding an empty cabin showing signs that someone had used it recently. They believed the robbers had stayed there while planning the holdup. This finding changed the direction of the investigation, as they soon discovered more campsites, probably used as temporary shelters while the criminals escaped. A careful search of the crime scene and hideouts led to the collection of important evidence. Among the items found at Tunnel 13 were a .45 caliber Colt automatic pistol, Payday branded bib overalls, a detonator, fuse wire and caps, several .45 caliber bullet casings, and 12-gauge shotgun shells. Investigators also collected various items from the cabin and nearby campsites, including a towel, a union suit, 3 brown canvas blanket bags, a burned coat, leather gloves, socks, a suitcase, and 2 cans. Perhaps most disturbing, they found 3 pieces of wire and bone in the cabin's fireplace, suggesting the extreme steps the fugitives had taken to hide their tracks. Despite all of this evidence, the DeAutremont brothers remained hard to find, disappearing into the wilderness while law enforcement tried to piece together where they went. The biggest manhunt in the region's history had to expand its scope even further, this time across the pond and into academia. After officials collected and organized all the evidence from the crime scene, they clearly understood how the deadly train robbery happened. However, they faced one big problem. They had no clue who did it. With no clear suspects, law enforcement made an unusual choice. They asked Edward Oscar Heinrich, a chemistry professor at the University of California, Berkeley, for help. At 42 years old, Heinrich had already helped Southern Pacific Railroad solve smaller train robberies, but this case would be his toughest challenge yet. In those days, forensic science as we know it today was just beginning. While crime labs existed in some parts of Europe, the United States hadn't created an official forensic department. The FBI crime lab wouldn't be established until 1932. This meant that asking a university professor to help with such an important case was an uncommon yet creative decision. Heinrich, known for his careful and scientific methods, thoroughly examined every piece of evidence given to him. For the longest time, these examinations were shared only through unverified newspaper reports. However, his official analysis was ultimately archived and recently unearthed. Now, we have full excerpts from his findings, including the following summary, written by Heinrich himself, that pinned down the exact profile of the suspected killers. The summary reads as follows. In the pencil pocket at the left side of the bib watch pocket, on the left front bib of the overalls, I found a receipt for a registered letter, postmarked Eugene, Oregon, September 14, 1923, registered. This receipt is numbered 2361 and is initialed for the postmaster Per B. From a microscopic examination of the dust, hair, and fibers collected from the pockets, chemical analysis of the stains on the garment, and a study of the set of his garment induced by wear, I am of the opinion that the wearer and owner was a lumberjack employed in a fir or spruce logging camp. I computed him, subject to revision with further data which might be found, to be a white man not over 5 feet 10 inches tall, probably shorter, weight not over 165 pounds, probably less, age between 21 and 25, When in city clothes, he is a careful dresser, neat in appearance, has medium light brown hair, complexion fair, has light brown eyebrows, well developed, and small hands and feet. I found the suspenders of the overalls were handled exclusively from the left side. Also, the pockets on the left side to be those most frequently used. The left suspender I also found to set 3/4 inches higher over the left shoulder than the right. The items found at the crime scene gave investigators more than just physical evidence. They revealed detailed information about at least one suspect. The pair of bib overalls showed wear only on the right side, suggesting the person who wore them likely stood against a tree while cutting wood, a typical position for a left-handed logger. The overall size helped guess the suspect's height and weight, and finding neatly cut fingernail clippings in the pockets indicated someone who cared about personal grooming. The most important clue, however, came from a receipt discovered in one of the pockets. It showed a $50 money order sent by Roy DeAutremont to his younger brother Hugh in Lakewood, New Mexico on September 14, 1923. This finding proved the first direct connection between the crime scene and the DeAutremont brothers. The aforementioned Professor Edward Oscar Heinrich, using his cutting-edge forensic methods for that time, carefully studied new pieces of evidence. He compared different handwriting samples, looked at fingerprints, studied bullets and shell casings, and even brought back the serial number on the found handgun. These techniques, which are now common in modern crime investigations, helped Heinrich build a clearer picture of the suspects and their activities. Investigators were finally led to the brothers' father, Paul DeAutremont, who confirmed that all three of his sons worked as lumberjacks and that Roy was left-handed, matching what they had figured out from the evidence. The .45 caliber Colt pistol found at the crime scene was traced to someone named William Elliott, but handwriting analysis showed that Elliott was actually Roy DeAutremont using a fake name. Sound familiar? More evidence linked Roy to a suitcase he had shipped to himself earlier that year. Hair found on the overalls placed Roy at the scene of the crime, while handwriting on receipts for supplies connected Hugh to the cabin where they had planned the robbery. As Heinrich's discoveries became public, people started calling him the Wizard of Berkeley and the Edison of crime detection. His work on the case was so influential that later that same year, Los Angeles created the first police crime lab in the United States. Its director, August Vollmer, had studied under Heinrich and also led the Berkeley Police Department. While the forensic evidence strongly showed that the DeAutremont brothers committed the robbery and murders, finding them proved much harder. The three men had disappeared off the map, no matter the evidence at hand. The federal government kept upping the ante, offering a $6,000 reward, plus an extra $7,000 from Southern Pacific Railroad and $900 from the Railway Express Company. By this point, the case had gained attention across the country, and investigators received many tips from people claiming to have seen the fugitives. Officials followed every lead, but none led to catching the brothers. In a final attempt to find them, the US government printed more than 2 million wanted posters in 6 different languages and sent them around the world. Despite this huge effort, the DeAutremonts stayed hidden, leaving authorities struggling to figure out what to do next. For many months, officials reached a standstill. The DeAutremont brothers had disappeared, and despite spreading wanted posters everywhere, no good leads turned up. Just when authorities started losing hope, an unexpected break came from a U.S. Army corporal named Thomas Reynolds. While stationed at Alcatraz Island in San Francisco, Reynolds happened to see a wanted poster and recognized Hugh DeAutremont as someone he had served with in the Philippines, where Hugh had used the name James Price. Reynolds quickly told his supervisors, and within 6 hours, Hugh DeAutremont was arrested. Though he admitted his real identity, he managed to delay his return to Oregon until March 1927. Once back in the state, he went on trial and was found guilty of first-degree murder. Although Hugh claimed he didn't know where his brothers were, his capture led federal authorities to send out new wanted posters. Just 2 months later, an anonymous tip guided investigators to Portsmouth, Ohio, where they found Ray and Roy DeAutremont living under fake names, Clarence and Elmer Goodwin, in nearby Steubenville. FBI agents caught the brothers on June 8, 1927, and they gave up without a fight. After being caught, the twins shared that they had first run to Detroit after the failed train robbery. Ray eventually got married, settling in Hanging Rock, Ohio, while Roy joined him months later. Trying to avoid being caught, they moved often between Portsmouth and Steubenville, but after the new posters went out, their luck ended. Ray had even tried to change how he looked by bleaching his hair, but this disguise ended in futility. The brothers were quickly sent back to Jackson County, Oregon, to face charges for the crimes during the Siskiyou Massacre. Their return happened at the same time as Hugh's murder trial, though this information was kept from him. Hugh was found guilty of first-degree murder, with the jury suggesting mercy. Ray and Roy, instead of fighting the charges, pleaded guilty. All three received life sentences at the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem. Not everyone agreed with the decision, however. Many called for the three men to receive capital punishment for their transgressions. The following was written in a local San Francisco paper soon after the final ruling. There has been much dissatisfaction over the fact that the DeAutremont brothers should have escaped the death penalty for their crime in the robbery and murders attendant upon their criminal attack on a Southern Pacific train. It was one of the most dastardly and contemptible crimes in recent history, and involved the killing of 3 working men, whose deaths were not even necessary to the carrying out of the robbery. We are of the opinion that the so-called confession of Hugh DeAutremont bears on its face a certain unreal swagger and insincerity, which should cause it to be regarded with great suspicion. The question presented by this case is not very easy of solution. For many reasons, it would seem better that the crime should have been proved against them by the state, if only for the purpose of showing the criminally inclined that in the long run, a crime career is not a paying career. It is very important that this lesson should be impressed upon wavering youth, and it does not seem to us that the method taken of ending the DeAutremont case was the best method. Somehow, the punishment does not seem to fit the crime. San Francisco Newsletter, July through December 1927 edition. After serving more than 30 years in prison, Hugh was released on parole in 1958. He moved to San Francisco and got a job as a printer, but his freedom didn't last long. Just 3 months after his release, doctors diagnosed him with stomach cancer, and he died on March 30th, 1959. Roy's time in prison affected him even more harshly. In 1949, doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia and moved him to the Oregon State Hospital in Salem. They performed a frontal lobotomy on him, which left him permanently disabled and unable to take care of himself. In 1979, he moved to a nursing home in Salem, where he needed constant care. He finally received parole in March 1983, though he stayed in the facility where he had been living for years. Roy DeAutremont died there on June 17, 1983, at the age of 83. Ray was the last brother to go free, leaving prison on October 27, 1961. When reporters asked how it felt to be free, he had trouble finding words before finally saying, "I'm trying to think of something to say. Well, you can imagine how it feels, can't you? But one thing is for sure. For the rest of my life, I will struggle with the question of whatever possessed us to do such a thing." After his release, Ray settled in Eugene, Oregon, working part-time as a janitor at the University of Oregon. He spent much of his later years painting and studying French and Spanish. In 1972, he asked then-Governor Tom McCall to grant him full freedom before he died, and his request was approved. Ray DeAutremont died in a Eugene nursing home on December 20th, 1984, at age 84. The three brothers, whose failed robbery led to one of the most notorious crimes in Oregon history, were finally buried together. They rest beside their mother at Bellcrest Memorial Cemetery in Salem, Oregon. The DeAutremont brothers' botched robbery and subsequent manhunt marked a pivotal moment in American criminal history. As the last major train robbers of the Old West era, they unwittingly became the bridge between two distinct periods of law enforcement. The case against them, built largely through Professor Heinrich's groundbreaking forensic work, signaled the end of investigations based primarily on hunches and eyewitness accounts. Instead, it ushered in the modern age of scientific crime solving that would dominate the 20th century. The methodical analysis of the crime scene, handwriting, and physical evidence that led to their capture represented the final nail in the coffin for outlaws who once relied on vast wilderness and limited communication to escape justice. As the DeAutremonts were captured, tried, and imprisoned, so too did America firmly close the chapter on its wild and lawless frontier past, trading six-shooters and wanted posters for microscopes and crime labs, a transformation as profound as it was inevitable. The Old West was finally becoming new.